Tonight's story sounds impossible. The United States almost tried to stop a bridge built by its closest ally that actually benefits American workers in order to win a trade fight. Not a military base, not a tariff law, a bridge. A $6 billion crossing over the Detroit River. Already approved, already funded, nearly finished. Suddenly became the center of an international confrontation between Washington and Ottawa. One late-night message triggered confusion across governments, panic inside supply chains, and a rare moment where politicians, businesses, and even rival parties all agreed on one thing. Blocking this project could hurt America more than Canada. So why threaten it? Was it leverage in a bigger economic war? A misunderstanding of a decade-old deal? Or a political move that accidentally targeted the wrong side? Because hidden behind this structure is a story involving monopolies, lawsuits, billion-dollar tolls, auto factories that can shut down in minutes, and a trade corridor responsible for nearly a quarter of all commerce between two nations. And once you understand what actually happens at this border every single hour, the threat suddenly makes far less sense and far more impact. This isn't just about a bridge. It's about how modern economies are so connected that one political decision in Washington can stall assembly lines hundreds of miles away. Let's break down what really happened. It was late, the kind of late where political statements are usually avoided. Governments slow down at night. Markets close. Diplomats sleep. Negotiations pause. But sometimes the most disruptive decisions happen when the world is quiet, because silence amplifies impact. And on one ordinary evening, a message appeared that would shake a relationship older than most countries on earth. The President of the United States posted a declaration, not about war, not about NATO, not about military defense. A bridge, a single bridge, a structure made of steel and cables spanning the Detroit River, suddenly transformed into the center of an international standoff. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, a project designed to improve trade, a project negotiated for years, a project already nearly finished, now described as unacceptable, now described as unfair, now potentially blocked. Within minutes, officials on both sides of the border were awake. Phones rang in Ottawa. Messages flooded Lansing. Advisors in Washington began clarifying what exactly had just happened. Because infrastructure projects do not normally become geopolitical flashpoints overnight. Yet this one did. And the reason goes far deeper than the river it crosses. To outsiders, Detroit and Windsor look like separate places. Different country, different government, different currency, but economically they behave like a single machine. Factories in Michigan assemble vehicles using parts stamped in Ontario. Engines built in Canada cross into the United States. Electronics installed in America return to Canada for finishing. Then finished vehicles cross back again for export. A single car may cross the border multiple times before completion. Not metaphorically, literally. The modern auto industry does not recognize borders the way politics does. It recognizes timing, and timing is everything. Production lines run on schedules measured in seconds. Deliveries run on schedules measured in minutes. Warehouses barely exist anymore. This system is called just-in-time manufacturing. It saves money, but it depends on absolute reliability. One late shipment stops the entire chain. And when the chain stops, losses multiply instantly. Hundreds of workers idle, machines pause, orders delay, all because a truck waited too long at a crossing. Now imagine that entire system relying on a single route, because for decades that is exactly what happened. The Ambassador Bridge opened in 1929. It was an engineering marvel of its time, connecting Canada and the United States in a way never before possible for heavy transport. But it was built for another era, an era before modern trade volume, an era before globalized manufacturing, an era before millions of parts moved daily across borders. And most importantly, it was privately owned. Over time, ownership consolidated under the Maroon family in Detroit, which meant one privately controlled crossing handled the majority of truck traffic between two major industrial nations. For decades, the arrangement worked. Traffic increased, revenue increased, and dependence increased, until dependence became vulnerability. Because monopolies in transportation carry a unique risk. They are single points of failure. If that bridge closed, even temporarily, factories across North America could halt within hours. And officials knew it. Concerns about redundancy began long before politics entered the conversation. Transportation planners quietly asked, what if maintenance shuts the bridge? What if an accident blocks lanes? What if a protest stops traffic? What if structural damage occurs? These were not theoretical scenarios. Each had already happened in smaller ways over the years. And every time industry leaders warned governments, you cannot have the most important trade corridor in North America dependent on one structure built in 1929. But solving the problem meant confronting a powerful reality. Any alternative crossing would compete directly with a private asset generating millions annually, which guaranteed opposition. Canada proposed something radical. They would pay for a new crossing, not share the cost, not request funding. They would finance it themselves. Billions of dollars, highway connections, inspection plazas, infrastructure on both sides of the border. In return, Michigan would eventually receive shared ownership and revenue once construction costs were recovered. To economists, this looked almost unprecedented. One country funding infrastructure partly located in another country, simply to secure trade stability. It demonstrated how intertwined the two economies had become. But to the monopoly owner, it represented existential threat. The response was immediate and fierce. Advertising campaigns warned taxpayers of hidden risks. Ballot initiatives attempted to force statewide approval for any new crossing. Legal challenges argued the government had no right to compete. For years, the battle unfolded not internationally, but locally. Courtrooms replaced diplomatic chambers. Lawyers replaced negotiators. Yet each challenge ultimately failed. Voters rejected the referendum. Courts dismissed exclusivity claims. Even the Supreme Court declined to intervene. The project survived every legal attempt to stop it, and once permits were issued, construction became inevitable. But inevitability does not prevent future politics. It only delays it. Foundations were poured. Towers rose slowly above the riverbanks. Cables stretched across the water. What had once been debate became reality. For most of the public, it faded into background news, another infrastructure project nearing completion. Even during the first Trump administration, the bridge was not controversial. Officials described it as economically beneficial. Funding related to customs operations was approved. Joint statements referenced cooperation. No major conflict existed, at least not yet. Years later, the global trade environment changed dramatically. Tariffs escalated. Supply chains became political tools. Economic nationalism grew. Allies began negotiating alternative trade relationships to reduce dependence. Canada pursued agreements abroad. The United States pushed domestic manufacturing protections. And slowly, routine infrastructure transformed into strategic leverage. The bridge, once about redundancy, now symbolized bargaining power. Not because the structure changed, because the context did. Then came the late-night message. The United States was being treated unfairly. Canada owned the bridge. Compensation should be demanded. Opening might be stopped. Within minutes, confusion spread across governments and industries alike. Because agreements existed, signed agreements, public agreements, years-old agreements, and they contradicted the claim. Michigan owned half. Revenue sharing existed. The project had bipartisan approval. But political messaging had already begun shaping perception, and perception travels faster than documentation. By sunrise, reactions began. Former officials corrected the record. Current leaders issued cautious responses. Businesses privately contacted representatives asking whether supply chains were at risk. Meanwhile, Canada responded calmly, not defensively, not aggressively, simply restating facts. The contrast became part of the story itself, because diplomacy is often about tone as much as substance. The dispute revealed something deeper than disagreement about ownership. It revealed how infrastructure can transform into negotiation leverage once broader conflicts exist. A bridge became a symbol of trade fairness, a symbol of sovereignty, a symbol of economic pressure. And once symbols enter politics, facts alone rarely resolve tension immediately. The conflict had begun. But the real story was only starting, because next came the most unusual part: a domestic political clash inside the United States itself, where a state's economic survival collided with federal negotiating strategy. When the message from Washington spread overnight, the first reaction did not come from Canada. It came from Michigan, not from political rivals, not from opposition parties, but from nearly everyone at the same time: Democrats, Republicans, business leaders, auto manufacturers, local officials. For once, they all agreed. This was a problem, because to Washington, the bridge was leverage in a negotiation. But to Michigan, the bridge was survival. Michigan's economy is not abstract. It does not live inside spreadsheets or quarterly reports. It lives on assembly lines, metal presses stamping body panels, robotic arms welding frames, engines assembled piece by piece. Every one of those steps depends on parts arriving exactly when needed, not hours early, not hours late, exactly on time. The modern auto industry abandoned massive warehouses decades ago. Storage costs money. Idle inventory wastes capital. So companies redesign manufacturing into a continuous moving chain. A moving chain that crosses the Canadian border repeatedly. An engine block cast in Ontario, shipped to Michigan for machining, returned to Canada for electronics, sent back again for final assembly. This happens thousands of times per day. And every time a truck waits at the border, a factory clock starts ticking. Economists often talk in billions. Factories talk in minutes. Because a single assembly plant shutdown can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour, millions per day, tens of millions per week. Not because machines break, because parts didn't arrive. Which means a traffic backup on a bridge in Detroit can shut down production in Ohio, or Ontario, or even Mexico. That is how integrated the system has become. And that is why the threat triggered panic, not anger, inside Michigan first. They understood the consequences instantly. Rick Snyder, the Republican governor who helped negotiate the original agreement, stepped forward publicly. He didn't respond emotionally. He responded mathematically. Michigan invested $0 construction dollars, yet secured half future ownership and long-term toll revenue. Blocking the bridge would not punish Canada. It would punish Michigan workers. Because companies don't wait for politics to settle. They relocate supply routes. They relocate investment. And sometimes they relocate factories. Snyder's argument was simple. You don't gain leverage by hurting your own economy first. For Michigan leaders, this was not theoretical policy. They remembered recent history. In 2022, a protest blockade briefly shut down the Ambassador Bridge. Within hours, auto plants halted production. Workers were sent home. Parts shipments backed up across the continent. It lasted days, but the economic ripple lasted weeks, and that was only a temporary disruption. Now imagine a political shutdown. Not an accident, not weather, a deliberate closure. The uncertainty alone could push manufacturers to diversify away permanently. That is the nightmare scenario policymakers feared. But there was another layer, one rarely discussed publicly: the Ambassador Bridge monopoly. For decades, nearly all truck traffic depended on one privately owned crossing. That meant pricing power, operational control, and influence over a continental trade artery. The new bridge changes that permanently. Competition lowers vulnerability. Redundancy lowers risk. But delaying it preserves the old system, which raised uncomfortable questions in Lansing and Detroit. Who actually benefits from blocking a second crossing? Because it was not factories, not truckers, not consumers. The economics pointed somewhere else entirely. Large manufacturers rarely speak loudly in political disputes. They prefer quiet lobbying. But behind closed doors, urgency grew. Executives warned officials that reliability matters more than policy rhetoric. Investment decisions are based on predictability. If border access becomes uncertain, companies don't wait for elections. They redesign logistics networks. And once supply chains move, they rarely return. The concern wasn't next week. It was the next decade. Michigan's governor avoided inflammatory language. Instead, the messaging stayed precise. The bridge supports jobs. The bridge supports industry. The bridge strengthens North American trade. No confrontation with Washington, but also no ambiguity. The state was signaling something important. This project is not optional to us. It is foundational. The conflict revealed a deeper structural tension inside modern governance. National governments negotiate strategy. Local economies live with consequences. In theory, trade leverage strengthens national position. In practice, leverage applied to physical infrastructure hits specific regions first. Michigan wasn't debating diplomacy. They were calculating payroll. Meanwhile, Canada's response remained restrained. They understood something subtle. The strongest argument against the threat was not Canadian, it was American. When local stakeholders oppose federal pressure, escalation becomes politically costly. So Ottawa emphasized cooperation. Let internal U.S. economics speak for itself. And it did. By this point, the story stopped being about ownership. It became about dependency. The United States and Canada do not merely trade with each other. They produce together, they build together. They manufacture as one distributed system separated by a border drawn long before modern industry existed. The bridge was designed to match economic reality. Blocking it meant forcing a 21st century supply chain into a 20th century bottleneck. Could the threat still serve negotiating leverage? Possibly. But leverage depends on who feels pressure first. And in this case, pressure concentrated locally before internationally. Michigan industries would react immediately. Canada's economy would react gradually, which meant the timeline of impact worked against the strategy. By the end of the first week, the narrative shifted. The debate was no longer, is the bridge fair? It became, who gets hurt first? And the answer was increasingly clear. The conflict had moved beyond diplomacy. Now it entered its most sensitive phase. How a century-old private monopoly, international trade policy, and domestic politics collided in one of the strangest economic standoffs between allies. Long before presidents argued about the bridge, before trade wars, before tariffs, there was simply a business, a very profitable one. Every day, thousands of trucks crossed the Detroit River, and almost every one of them paid a toll to the same place. For decades, the Ambassador Bridge wasn't just infrastructure. It was an economic gatekeeper. A single privately owned structure controlling one of the busiest commercial corridors in the world. And unlike most border crossings, it wasn't operated by a government authority. It belonged to a family. To understand why the new bridge became controversial, you have to understand what monopoly actually means in transportation. If multiple roads exist, competition keeps prices stable. But if only one path exists, that path becomes indispensable. The Detroit-Windsor corridor carries massive trade volume because geography leaves few alternatives. Rail handles some freight, ships handle bulk goods, but trucks carry the lifeblood of modern manufacturing: components, small parts, time-sensitive shipments, assembly line deliveries. And those trucks had only one practical crossing. So every manufacturer, every supplier, every logistics company depended on the same choke point. Dependence creates leverage. As trade grew in the late 20th century, planners recognized a dangerous reality. The most important land trade artery in North America relied on a single privately owned bridge built in 1929. It wasn't designed for modern volume. It wasn't designed for modern security standards. And it definitely wasn't designed for just-in-time manufacturing. Officials worried less about cost and more about risk, because infrastructure failure doesn't negotiate. If the bridge closed, supply chains stopped. So governments proposed a second crossing, not to replace the first, to protect against it. And that's when conflict began. The existing bridge owners did not quietly accept competition. They launched one of the most aggressive infrastructure opposition campaigns in modern regional history. Advertising warned taxpayers of hidden liabilities. Political lobbying intensified. Public messaging framed the project as unnecessary government intrusion. Then came a ballot initiative. The proposal required statewide voter approval before any new international bridge could be built. If passed, it would likely delay or kill the project indefinitely. The campaign cost tens of millions of dollars, but voters rejected it by a wide margin. The public wanted redundancy. The project survived. But the legal battle had only started. After losing politically, the fight moved into federal courts. The argument shifted from public policy to property rights. Lawyers claimed the owners possessed exclusive crossing authority. If accepted, the claim would effectively prevent any competing bridge. Multiple cases were filed. Multiple courts dismissed them. Appeals followed. Appeals failed. Eventually, the challenge reached the highest level available, and even there the effort stopped. The project could legally proceed. But the opposition never truly ended. It simply changed strategies. Why fight so hard? Because this wasn't just a bridge. It was proof of concept. If a publicly supported crossing succeeded, it would permanently end monopoly pricing power. Traffic would split. Negotiation leverage would disappear. Revenue certainty would decline. From a business perspective, the stakes were existential. From a public perspective, the stakes were resilience. Two different definitions of necessity. While construction slowly advanced, the issue faded from national headlines. But locally, everyone understood what was coming. The moment the new bridge opened, competition would exist for the first time in generations. Truck routing choices would expand, operational risk would shrink, and economic influence would rebalance. For years, it remained a technical infrastructure story, until politics rediscovered it. When Washington suggested blocking the project, local observers immediately noticed something unusual. Stopping the bridge would not restore negotiations. It would restore dependency. The same dependency policymakers had spent decades trying to eliminate, which raised a sensitive question many avoided asking publicly. Was the bridge being treated as foreign leverage or domestic economic leverage? Because the practical effect was clear. Delay benefits the existing crossing. Opening benefits the broader economy. Suddenly, unlikely voices aligned. Labor unions supported opening. Jobs relied on stable supply chains. Manufacturers supported opening. Production relied on redundancy. Local governments supported opening. Regional growth relied on reliability. The rare consensus cut across political ideology. Free market advocates favored competition. Public planners favored resilience. Even some fiscal conservatives supported it. The state paid nothing up front. In modern politics, agreement that broad is unusual, and that made the dispute even more visible. Infrastructure conflicts are rarely about concrete. They are about control. Who controls movement controls commerce. Who controls commerce influences policy. And whoever controls a choke point gains power far beyond its physical size. The Gordie Howe Bridge was never just adding capacity. It was redistributing control. International negotiations often operate in abstractions, tariffs, percentages, agreements. But infrastructure is physical. You cannot renegotiate a truck waiting in line. You cannot delay a factory expecting parts. You cannot pause a conveyor belt because diplomacy needs time. Physical systems demand immediate solutions. That is why this conflict became so unusual. Political timelines move slowly. Supply chains move hourly. By now, the story had evolved beyond a disagreement. It had become a collision between three forces: international trade strategy, domestic economic security, and private infrastructure power. But the most delicate phase was still ahead, because next came the diplomatic chess match, where words mattered as much as contracts. Canada chose restraint. Instead of counter threats or retaliation, Ottawa responded with documentation. Agreements were cited, ownership clarified, financing explained. The strategy was deliberate. Escalation would turn the bridge into a political fight. Calm would turn it into a factual one. So the Canadian government framed the issue simply. The project was negotiated legally. The project benefits both countries. The project changes nothing about sovereignty. By refusing confrontation, Canada shifted the pressure inward, toward American states, industries, and lawmakers who depended on the crossing. The argument stopped being Canada versus Washington. It became economics versus rhetoric. Automakers rarely comment publicly on diplomatic disputes, but internally the situation was serious. Modern vehicle production crosses the border multiple times before completion. Engines, electronics, and structural components move back and forth constantly. If reliability weakens, companies don't argue. They redesign supply chains. That means shifting routes, then shifting suppliers, eventually shifting factories. And once factories move, they almost never return. The concern wasn't a temporary delay, it was uncertainty, the one factor global manufacturing avoids at all costs. A blocked crossing would not stop at Detroit. Within hours, factories slow, warehouses fill, shipping schedules collapse. Within days, production pauses, workers sent home, prices rise. Within months, investment decisions change. A single bottleneck could ripple across the continent, which is why redundancy, not capacity, was the real goal of the new bridge. It wasn't meant to increase trade, it was meant to protect it. From a negotiation perspective, infrastructure pressure can create leverage, but only if the other side feels the impact first. Here, geography reversed the timeline. Michigan industries would feel disruption immediately. Canada would feel it gradually. So the cost curve pointed inward before outward. That made the strategy risky. Because leverage works best when consequences are distant, not local. In the end, the structure remained what it always was: a trade corridor built because two economies function as one. The controversy did not change the contracts, did not change ownership, did not change geography. It simply exposed how dependent modern industry has become on stability. Soon trucks will cross daily, quietly, routinely, and the headlines will fade. But the episode leaves an enduring question. In an interconnected world, can economic infrastructure ever truly become political leverage without first applying pressure at home?